Hey there, kids. It's not your dad, but your Loredad, here with my second collaboration. I am very honored to be able to collaborate with Plausible History on this very special video. Seeing as the channel is 1 year old, I feel it's time to do the kind of video every alternate history YouTuber has to do at some point. What if the Axis won World War II? I'm going to take my holistic approach using my usual method of a single point divergence. I'll be going into what I feel is most reasonable. Britain piecing out with Germany on limited terms in order to preserve their empire. I'm really excited to go deep into this timeline and explore all of its ramifications, but due to the fact that I'm using a single point divergence, the resulting world will be relatively tame. If you want to see a world where everything went right for the Axis, check out Plausible History's video on the topic. Link will be in the top right in the description. With that being said, let's start exploring this timeline together. September 1st, 1939. The Germans invade Poland after the refusal to concede Danzig. In response, Britain and France demanded that Germany withdraw from Poland and cease the invasion. After the Germans ignored this demand, Britain and France declared war on Germany in defense of Poland. What resulted was a period known as the Phony War, where Germany had annexed Poland, subjugated Denmark, and invaded Norway with no meaningful territorial exchanges in Western Europe. This must have given the Allies a false sense of security, one that Germany had intended to exploit. The ultimate example of blitzkrieg, lightning warfare, was unleashed upon Western Europe, as Germany invaded the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg with unseen levels of speed. This invasion was so fast and unexpected that hundreds of thousands of British and French troops were surrounded in the port city of Dunkirk. This encirclement had led to many within Britain to fear the fate of their men in a war that seemed to be completely lost. It was at this point in our history that Lord Halifax had proposed the idea of exploring German terms of peace as a means to avoid the escalation of the conflict to include Italy, who at the point of the statement being issued had not yet joined the conflict. After discussing several options regarding a potential point of divergence that would have led to an Axis victory, Plausible History and I agreed that one of the most plausible timelines for this outcome would have been the proposal of Halifax becoming British policy, rather than never surrendering like Churchill had insisted on. Now, you may find it interesting that this is the exact same point of divergence that Cody of Alternate History Hub used for his video on the topic. I want to reassure you that while we have the same point of divergence, we have very different views regarding the outcome of this divergence, so please stay tuned. And of course, if you haven't watched the video, I really recommend it. It's a good one. So, Halifax's proposal of a limited peace with Germany becomes the new position of the British, and peace negotiations begin. While many Axis victory scenarios use this point of divergence to grant Germany and Italy all of their claimed territories against Britain, I find it very important to note that this goes against the spirit of the peace negotiations. The idea that Britain would accept all stipulations of peace at this point of history is certainly a possibility, but in my opinion, it's just implausible. What I propose for this timeline is that Italy is granted their claimed territories against France, but gain no land against Britain. This seems like an incredibly implausible outcome, as the idea that Italy would not gain anything against Britain would surely destroy the Italian-German alliance. However, it's worth noting that by the time the French had surrendered in our timeline, Italy had only joined the conflict 12 days before. It's also worth noting that the vote to determine foreign policy between peace and no surrender had been determined in the later weeks of May. So if it did resolve quickly to surrender, let's say after a week of negotiations ending June 7th, Italy would not have even declared war on France or Britain. Despite the potential straining of the Pact of Steel, Germany would be seeking to peace out with Britain. Mustache Man had an admiration of their empire and felt like continuing a conflict between each other would only delay his ambitions in the East. In order to prevent the Pact of Steel potentially collapsing following this limited peace, there would need to be some concessions through other means. These stipulations could take the form of demilitarizing Malta and Cyprus, granting special concessions to the Germans and Italians through the Suez, a generous amount of war reparations, and a guarantee of no further British involvement in regards to the Axis and their designs in Europe. I believe this peace would be good enough to placate the Italians, while also not being substantial enough to cause Britain to reject the peace. With Britain out of the war, there's no doubt that they would surrender to the Germans and the Italians, who would have joined just before they decided to surrender. Italy would get all their claimed territories against France, and Germany would get Alsace-Lorraine. And we'll go into more detail exactly on what other things will happen to France, but for now I want to talk about Britain and their situation. With Britain bowing down to the Germans, they were extremely humiliated. Unable to support exiled governments by recognizing Germany's dominance in Europe, and forced to pay sizable economic reparations, the prestige of the empire was significantly diminished. However, the empire was still whole. After the end of the Great War, the British had imposed tariffs on their trade between the home isles and their dominions. While this tariff system had been reduced in order to improve the economy of the empire through imperial preference, it's possible that in order to relieve the burden of economic reparations, the policy of imperial preference would be suspended. This isolationism and disgruntlement with the tariffs on rightful British territory would lead to Turtleneck Man and his fashionistas to gain more popularity. In our history, before World War II and before the Turtleneck Man had begun wearing his turtleneck, he issued a memorandum that called for this exact policy to be enacted. However, his ideas were rejected. This, among many other factors, would eventually lead to him donning the turtleneck and encouraging others to follow his fashion trend. While he would eventually relinquish his turtleneck following the defeat of the Germans and Italians in World War II, he would have no reason to change his fashion preference and would become a major thorn in the side of the democratic process in Britain. The exact manner of how politics would solidify in Britain are something we'll cover in the future. But for now, let's explore the alternate outcome of the armistice campaign. With the British out of the conflict and peace returning to Europe, the conditions of our timeline's armistice would be completely different in this timeline, with the most obvious divergence being that this wouldn't even be an armistice, it would be a peace treaty. For example, the occupation of northern France and the Atlantic coast by the German army was agreed upon by the Vichy government with the understanding that this was a temporary war measure, meant to ensure the Germans' capability to wage war against the British. With the British out of the conflict, this would be deemed unnecessary. Instead, the Germans would be seeking a more permanent solution. While it would be reasonable to assume that the Germans would have only annexed Alsace-Lorraine, this is Mustache Man we're talking about. In our timeline's armistice between Germany and France, the Germans had occupied a border strip of France known as the Closed Zone, an area meant to be resettled by Germans and incorporated into the Reich. Therefore, when the Germans would be looking at this peace deal with France, they would insist that our timeline's closed zone would just be annexed into Germany. With such heavy territorial losses and significant economic compensation, France would not be far off from being a satellite state of the Germans. These terms seem incredibly unreasonable, but what could they do? Britain has signed away the rights to intervene in the continent, and the Germans occupy half of their country. They would need to accept any peace terms. With the Germans' annexation of the Benelux into their state, the colonial empires of these two European nations were left unaddressed by the Germans. While this is a very interesting problem the West will need to address, we'll explore the ramifications in Part 2. For now, we must turn our eyes back to Europe and observe the grave consequences of the Dunkirk peace. Mustache Man had sought to thrust Germany into war. Many people of Germany, from civilians to high-standing officers of the German army, were wary of the consequence of an elongated conflict. Once Germany had managed to pass through the Ardennes and quickly capture Paris, the fear of failure had subsided, and in its stead, an arrogance had emerged. This arrogance would lead to strategic failures, which ultimately destroyed the Reich, as they underestimated the stoicism of the British. However, in this alternate timeline, the British had conceded defeat directly to the Germans. Mustache Man had done the impossible and surpassed the great Germans before him. But he wasn't done yet. Mustache Man had envisioned a continent subject to his will. Now, with the Dunkirk peace preventing a British intervention, he had a blank check to shape it as he saw fit. Spain and Portugal, under far-right dictatorships, would be aligned with the Reich. France and Britain were humiliated, and Italy was a direct military ally. The remaining nations of Europe of Switzerland, Sweden, Finland, Yugoslavia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and Greece now had the choice of death or dishonor. Switzerland and Sweden's policy of neutrality had given confidence to the Germans that they would not pose any direct threat for their militaries, so the remaining nations of the Balkans would need to choose their alignment. Hungary would join the Axis after the Vienna Awards of southern Slovakia and northern Transylvania. Romania would join the Axis despite their petitions by Bulgaria, Hungary, and the Soviet Union, and Yugoslavia would seek to join, but would be overthrown by anti-collaborators before being partitioned by the Axis. All of these nations and their choice of alignment would not differ from our timeline. What will most certainly change with this point of divergence as compared to our history is the nature of Greece's subjugation. In our timeline, Greece was invited into the Tripartite Pact, but Metaxas, despite his fashion trends, refused to join. This is most likely due to the fact that they feared Italian ambitions of their country, as Bulgaria had claimed northern Greece, and Yes Man's Greater Italy had claimed the islands of Greece, and the rest of it becoming an Italian protectorate. Because Britain was not able to intervene without directly breaking their treaty, and was therefore completely isolated, Metaxas would join the Axis. This would eventually lead to them being carved up anyway, but for now, we must turn our eyes to the east, as the Germans would finally be prepared to invade the Soviet Union. Mustache Man had sought to expand the Lebensraum of the German Volk. Despite Mustache Man's clear outline in his book, Steelman had signed a pact with Mustache Man, enabling both of their expansions against their neighbors. But why? Well, if I was Steelman, I would try to get the fashionistas to fight the liberals, while slowly consolidating my strength before spreading the revolution to the losing party. And there is evidence to support that this was likely Steelman's plan. However, before Steelman could go on the offensive, the Soviet Union was invaded by Germany. In June 1941, the same time as our history, Germany would perform Operation Barbarossa with far more success than in our timeline. The exact outcome is incredibly difficult to properly speculate, as many factors contributed to the initial successes of the Germans, but due to the point of divergence that we've established, it's possible that the Germans could eventually become victorious. The initial war aims of the operation were to seize the three main cities of the Soviet Union: Leningrad, Moscow, and Stalingrad, and with the AA line, the Arkhangelsk-Astrakhan line, being the initial ambitions of capture by this invasion. Many believe that the AA line was the furthest extent that Mustache Man had wished to go, but in reality, he had wished for his Germany to conquer all the way up to the Urals to gain the resources there and use the mountains as a natural boundary to protect their eastern colonies from being recaptured by the Russians. For the sake of making things simple, let's say by winter 1941, the Germans able to take Moscow, but not the other two cities. According to some historical sources, it's said that Steelman had refused to leave Moscow. Let's say that instead of this being pure propaganda, it's completely true. If so, it's possible that if the German army were able to take Moscow, the leader of the USSR would have either been captured or killed, causing significant chaos within the USSR. This chaos and loss of morale would lead to the Soviet armies not able to resist further. And once winter passes and the springtime comes, the Germans would be able to capture the remaining two cities and slowly extend their occupation of the Ural Mountains. During the invasion, Greek communists would attempt to overthrow the Metaxas regime, but this would be the exact opportunity that the Axis were hoping for, as they carved up Greece between themselves. Normally, at this point of conflict between nations, the nation with the advantage would seek to negotiate with the nation at a disadvantage with hopes to end the conflict. But this is no ordinary war. This war waged by the Germans had the explicit motivation of utterly destroying the Soviet state. Mustache Man would not even give any sort of Soviet successor state the international recognition of a peace deal. In his mind, the Soviet state had ceased to exist, with Siberia becoming a wasteland of warlords and anarchy, and so Germany would be officially at peace by 1944. But even with the Lebensraum and the utter subjugation of Europe to his will, they did not achieve their ultimate victory, their Endsieg, just yet. The Dunkirk peace between Germany and Britain had ensured Britain's lack of involvement in Europe, but the treaty was due to expire. Germany, who previously lacked the resources that they required to make a fleet, would be able to use the resources from their new colonies to fuel the rapid expansion of the German Navy. But would they even be able to extract the resources from their conquered territories? Would Germany's iron grip on Europe hold? How would the destruction of the Soviet Union affect the world? How would the fate of Asia differ from our history? Would this even count if a Cold War if the Americans have nukes and the Germans wouldn't? What do you mean the Germans wouldn't? And besides, isn't this just Thousand Week Reich? All these questions and more will be answered in part 2, which is out right now. You can go watch it right now. Surprise! 2 videos in one day. Go watch it. Shout out to Enzo Rafael Souza Silva, Louis Avant, Grud, Jubs, and Solo Leo for being channel members. Thank you so much for your support. If you want to have your name shouted out at the end of my video, please consider supporting the channel by getting a membership. Thanks again for Possible History for this collaboration, but it's not over yet. See you in part 2, where we explore the outcome of this German victory.